Okay, so for Germany, we start with the Northern Renaissance. So if we take a step back before that, remember we would have had the Merchant Alliance, the Hanseatic League, that was formed in the Middle Ages. It had seen its best day by the time this rolls around, but its strength in the northern part of Germany is a good illustration of just how much trade there is there. And this is part of the reason why when the Renaissance begins to diffuse as a result of the printing press, it's going to head into this type of area. All right, so around 1450, Gutenberg develops a movable type press, and this is going to allow ideas, and we're going to see for Germany, this is particularly important because these are going to be the ideas we're talking about now, the Renaissance ideas, and the ideas of the Reformation. So what goes along with the printing press, which we tend to associate with literature, is the art of that day. And so many of the German Northern Renaissance artists were noted not just for their painting or sculpting, but also for their woodcuts. And so woodcuts were a way of reaching the illiterate audience that that many of the propagandists we're about to talk about wanted to reach, or people were trying to persuade people of religious changes. And so that is a rise of individualism in the northern part of Germany, as kind of paralleling what we would have seen in the northern part of Italy. And so the Northern Renaissance then is going to impact art in similar ways to the impact on the Italian Renaissance, although again there's more of that focus on printing and more of that focus on a natural depiction of human beings. So the other difference between the Northern Renaissance and the Italian version is the influence of humanism. And so if we kind of look at this in terms of the relationship to the church, we have Rome as the center of the church. Areas in Italy are close to Rome and often had formed alliances with Rome. And so there is this danger then in turning humanist rationalism and the critiques of humanist rationalism against the church and its teachings. The Austrians in the southern part of Germany were less likely to do this because they were benefiting from that alliance with the church as well. Whereas far away in the north, you have people who are seeing a lot of their wealth go away to Rome, where it was misused and used to finance things like St. Peter's Basilica. The Germans at one point were even misled and told they were raising money for a new crusade, and found out later that nope, that money was not used for a crusade, it was used for building projects in Rome. And so from the perspective of people in the north, the church was all about money, and it was sinful, and it had to some degree or another lost its way. Now this does not mean that they want to break away, but what happens here lays the foundation for the breakaway movement that follows. So Christian humanism is one element of this. So we have Erasmus, who was not German, but in the Low Countries, in what's today the Netherlands. And he argues that the Catholic Church has failed to focus on the philosophy of Christ, that it worries too much about doctrines like, is the Virgin Mary still a virgin after Jesus is born, than it does about the poverty of Christians and that sort of thing. So that is one movement that we would see, using humanism to challenge Catholic interpretations and practices. The other thing that's going on by the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period is the development of what we would call lay Christianity. So the church had become so fixated on ritual and priestly power that some people engaged in these kind of popular gatherings. Now, they're not saying that you don't need priests, and they're not saying that they don't need the church, but they were basically contending that the way to feel this true spirituality was not through the church, it was by everybody coming together and praying together, or everybody coming together and performing rituals together. And there's a strong parallel to the more radical versions of the Reformation that will happen later on. So lay Christians are basically Christians that practice the religion outside of the church. So these are the two currents kind of leading us into the Reformation that follows. So this is from a famous biography of Martin Luther, Here I Stand. And it's a good illustration of the limits of the Renaissance. So the Renaissance, remember, is an urban movement. It's influencing the property classes in cities. And here it shows how it has no effect on Luther and the people he knows. And they still believe in witches, they still believe in demons, they still believe in magic. And so this is in the mind of a person who was educated at the time. And so there's kind of this persistence of tradition in Germany in spite of all the rational movements in the cities. So that brings us to this next piece. So what we're going to talk about is the Reformation only in the empire and not go into what happened in France and Britain, because we talked about those separately. The Reformation, remember, is when the Catholic Church splits. And so we end up with the Catholic Church, and we end up with a variety of Protestant movements. And so let's look at the background to that. So part of what's going on here politically is resistance to this Habsburg model of a universal Christian kingdom. So the Habsburgs were at this point under Charles V, who governed Spain, the Spanish Empire, much of Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire. And so there was this unease with that he was trying to create kind of a global empire, or at least a general European empire at that point. And so remember that at the same time, we have this commercialization that's going on. And so money, the ability to get money, matters a whole lot more at this time than it did 500 years earlier. So before, if we were to go back 500 years, the exchange of land for service was what mattered the most. Being able to get service in exchange for land and holding onto land was the greatest source of wealth. Well, as Europe commercializes and engages in more long-distance trade, the ability to get your hands on money matters a lot more. As we shift to gunpowder weapons and the soldiers that bear them, then you're going to need a lot more money in order to finance those armies. And so for many of the northern German princes, they could kill two birds with one stone by embracing the Reformation. So breaking away from the religion of the Habsburg emperors, Catholicism, was a way of asserting political independence. And it also enabled them to seize the church's land and tax it, which solved some of their money problems. And so this is one of the things we want to understand. Why does this happen now? Why is it going on now? Why not earlier? Because Martin Luther, when he comes along, he's going to say things like, everyone should be able to read the Bible and interpret it for themselves. Faith matters more than anything else. Popes and priests have no special power. But there were earlier reformers who had said the same thing. So why wasn't there a Reformation when Jan Hus of Bohemia came along and said those things? Well, there wasn't a printing press, and there wasn't the same commercialization. There wasn't the same resistance to political centralization that we would see during this time. So when Martin Luther kind of enters the scene, it's at first not to attack the church's power, but to criticize one of the forms of corruption practiced by the church at this point. So the Catholic Church had a lot of rules about corruption and was breaking many of those rules. During the Renaissance, there were a series of popes who did not come from very religious backgrounds and who cared a lot more about patronizing art and expanding their military power than they did about religion. And so that's in that context that Martin Luther attacks the sale of indulgences. So indulgences were grants of forgiveness for sins, and there is a salesman of indulgences who is going through the German states and claiming that when the coin and coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. So Martin Luther, according to the legend, nails his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg. And we have no confirmation that he did this, but it's plausible, because this was a way of throwing down the gauntlet and announcing that you wanted to debate an issue. The Catholic Church responds. They send officials up to question Luther and engage him in a public debate. And over the course of that debate, Luther goes beyond just criticizing the sale of indulgences and says he does not believe that the Pope has any special power. that his reading of the Bible, and especially the letters of Paul, have led him to conclude that good works don't matter at all. It is purely through faith that a person is saved, that a person is justified, he said. So Martin Luther, though, is a more conservative religious reformer because he wants to maintain the political status quo. And so when the Reformation gets going, he's careful to give the local princes the power over the church. And he says that really the princes who are the ordained by God should be calling the shots when it comes to religion. But nevertheless, we can see how what he says would lead to more radical movements. So radical movements would include the Calvinists that we talked about with France. They would also include the Anabaptists. So the Anabaptists say, okay, well, our reading of the Bible tells us that Jesus didn't baptize infants, that people should be able to make their own decision. All the people that Jesus baptized chose to be baptized, and all the people baptized by John the Baptist chose to be baptized. They weren't compelled to do so. And so religion should be a matter of conscience. So the extension of that is there shouldn't be a state religion. And so the Anabaptists were a much more radical movement in that they were attacking the existing political system and the social status quo by extension. Even more radical than that movement was the peasant movement of the time. So when Luther announced that all people were equal before God, he inadvertently undermined the feudal system, which was held by the church to be ordained by God. And so if the church is wrong about priests having special authority in religion, then it makes sense that the church would also be wrong about the Catholic Church, or about the feudal system having special religious meaning. And so the peasants rise up in rebellion. And this is known as the German Peasants' War. So there we have the Peasants' War as a more radical element of the Reformation that Luther puts down. Luther's changes also introduce a lot of questions about women. And these questions aren't settled during this time. But what we could say kind of in the short term is that Luther does lead women to be held in greater esteem than before. Luther, when he begins this movement, gets married himself to a former nun. It ends up being a loving marriage, producing children that Luther adored. And so Luther then uses his influence to promote motherhood as being worthy of esteem. And yet, what Luther has also done by ending the monastic system and the choice that women had of becoming nuns, he has condemned women to one path, which is marriage and raising children. And so there are going to be all kinds of questions in about, well, what kinds of opportunities should women have, and what does the Reformation mean for women? Because while Luther had a very positive view of women, we know that the religious nature of the Reformation leads to a spike in witch hunts and witchcraft trials, and there's also that going on at the same time. Luther was called by the Holy Roman Emperor to explain himself and refused to recant, and that kind of began this conflict that ultimately becomes a civil war in the German states. And so Charles V didn't want to fight the Lutherans in the northern part of Germany. He wanted to fight the Ottomans, and he wanted to fight other enemy groups, and he couldn't fight them all at one time. And so this is the reason why the German emperors and Charles V here support the Peace of Augsburg. The Peace of Augsburg says this, that the ruler of a German state can determine the religion of that state as long as they choose between the two religions of that time, two Christian religions of that time, which were Catholicism and Lutheranism. However, there are a lot of things that aren't clearly settled by the Peace of Augsburg. Did Charles V mean that the Peace of Augsburg established this norm for 1555, but not afterwards? So in other words, if a prince became Lutheran after 1555, did the Peace of Augsburg apply to his state? this is not clear. And we know if that prince after 1555 becomes Lutheran, what will happen next is he'll take the church's land. So was that legitimate? The Peace of Augsburg said if you took the land before 1555, yes, you could keep it. But it didn't say anything about after 1555. There are going to be lots of debates over where this should go. But for the decades that follow, the Peace of Augsburg does establish religious peace within the German states, more or less. So what gets builds the pressure towards another conflict is the Catholic Reformation. So the Catholic Reformation is when the Catholic Church tries to reassert itself. So looking at this in German terms, what this would mean is that the Habsburgs would try to reassert Catholicism in the areas that they could. And so one of those areas, and where this is really going to matter, would be Bohemia. The Habsburgs ruled Bohemia directly. So remember, under the Peace of Augsburg, the prince of the area determines the religion. So that means that the Habsburgs have the power to make Bohemia Catholic again. So the Catholic Reformation begins as a move to kind of clarify religious doctrines and to clean up corruption. And what it becomes more and more is an effort to reassert church control in areas that had been lost by the Catholic Church. And this was especially true in the southern part of Germany. And so that is what tarnishes the emperor's reputation. So the Holy Roman Emperors, Charles V and his heirs, they were seen as like the umpire. They called balls and strikes. They didn't get involved. But they increasingly were involved in the Catholic Reformation. And so this is going to heighten religious tension and heighten religious tension and heighten religious tension until we get the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, which starts in Bohemia when the emperor sends emissaries to Bohemia to announce that he's re-Catholicizing them. The Bohemians defenestrate the emissaries. They toss them out a window, setting off the 30 Years' War. And so the 30 Years' War goes through 4 phases. And the first phase is that Bohemian phase. And then we have a Danish phase where the King of Denmark enters the war on the side of the Protestants. That ends with the Habsburg forces victorious. And so at the end of the Danish phase, the Habsburgs are on the verge of more or less total victory here. They issue an edict of restitution announcing that any land that had been taken by a Protestant prince since 1555 was going to be returned to the Catholic Church. Well, this is what sets off alarms throughout Europe. Now the Habsburgs potentially have too much power, and among Protestants, maybe they're going to try to be intolerant of Protestants to an even greater degree than before. And so we enter the second half of the war with the last 2 phases. The Swedish phase, Gustavus Adolphus, financed by France, he was successful for a while and then ends up dying in battle. And then the French phase. This is when Richelieu, the Cardinal of France, who is a Catholic, leading a Catholic country, enters the war on the side of the Protestants. The war finally ends in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. And there you can see the German population, which falls by roughly a third during this conflict. The war saw innovations militarily where we're shifting decisively in the direction of gunpowder armies that were difficult to afford. And so it's in this war that we would see still policies like armies being financed by sacking cities rather than by taxation. But the 30 Years' War, from the German perspective, does a few different things. One is it expands the Peace of Augsburg so that it includes Calvinism. And so the kind of bigger picture is that within the Holy Roman Empire, princes were more or less allowed to choose which form of Christianity they wanted to practice. The emperor could not determine that. And the other change is that it creates such political decentralization by giving the princes virtual autonomy within their states that it essentially disintegrates the empire. It dissolves the empire. And so while the Holy Roman Empire continues to limp on in name until it's finally destroyed by Napoleon, it did not exist as a political entity from this point on. And so that is going to set German unification back decades. And this is a decisive moment for German unification in the long run. And it's going to lead to religious and political divisions that will take a long time for the Germans to overcome. All right, the last thing I want to talk about today then is the formation of Prussia. And so this is from a book on the formation of Prussia. And so it's kind of giving you an idea of what it is that leads to that country forming in the way it does. Prussia was at a crossroads in the 30 Years' War, and they tried everything. They tried allying with the Habsburgs, and they were invaded by Protestants. They tried allying with the Protestants, and they were invaded by the Habsburgs. They tried staying neutral, and they were invaded by both. And so the determination that's going to be made by the Prussian rulers after this is we need to centralize and form a permanent, highly disciplined gunpowder army. It's our only chance because Prussia had a small population. It's not contiguous territorially, and so that is part of what we're going to see after the 30 Years' War. So following the 30 Years' War then, with the Holy Roman Empire increasingly obsolete, we're going to see two states emerge as great powers from that empire. So one of those states is Austria. What the Habsburgs are going to do is consolidate their control over the areas they governed directly. And so that would include Bohemia and Hungary. They reclaim Hungary from the Ottomans during this period. And so there is a good degree of centralization that occurs within that part of the Holy Roman Empire, the areas that the Habsburgs directly controlled. So the areas called their hereditary territories. The Habsburgs would have inherited them. All right, then we see the emergence of Prussia. So the map in the top right shows us the problem faced by Prussia. So at first, it's just this area of Brandenburg. And then you have the inheritance of Polish Prussia. Those two areas aren't contiguous, followed by the inheritance and addition of other non-contiguous territories. On top of that, there aren't a lot of resources in Prussia. And so it looks like this is not a state that's ever going to emerge as a great power. So what happens, though, is there are a series of capable rulers that are going to be able to use the 30 Years' War to convince their population to buy into elements of absolutism. And so Frederick William, the great elector, gets the ball rolling on this. He's the guy who creates the standing army of Prussia, and he is able to convince his nobles and members of the middle class, these are both in Prussia, as powerful as they would be, relatively speaking, as they would be in places like the Netherlands or England. And yet they agree to this because of the example of the 30 Years' War. And so what that means is that the Prussian monarchs are given the power to tax and to run the army as a centralized army. In exchange, the nobles are given a good deal of control over their private estates, over the peasants, and there's kind of this bargain that the nobles will serve as the officers in this military. As for the middle class, you get peace, which is more conducive to business, and the Prussian rulers basically created an atmosphere conducive to business. So this is seen by all of those parties as preferable to what they saw during the 30 Years' War. Okay, so that brings us to the 18th century. So in the 18th century, the 1700s, we had Frederick William, who established this system. Then we have Frederick I, who's the first king of Prussia. And then we have Frederick William I, the king, who strengthens Prussia's standing army. But up until this time, that strong, centralized standing army hadn't been used. So this is where Frederick II, who's known as Frederick the Great, enters the scene. Frederick the Great is known, we'll talk about him in connection to the Enlightenment, known as an enlightened monarch. That's often what he's connected to. But here is an example of kind of his political outlook when it comes to foreign policy. So one of the Habsburg emperors is dying, and there up at the top middle is Maria Theresa, his daughter, who is going to inherit. And before Maria Theresa inherited, the emperor had everybody sign a pragmatic sanction saying that they were going to respect her territory. And Frederick the Great of Prussia signs this thinking, yeah, right, nobody's really going to take this seriously. And so he immediately breaks the agreement when Maria Theresa inherits, and he invades, you can see the map in the bottom left, the territory of Silesia, and essentially steals it from Maria Theresa. And this leads to a conflict, the War of the Austrian Succession, which threatened at one point to dismember Austria. Now, the Austrians were able to successfully get the Hungarians to support them, so to keep the empire together that way. And while they lose Silesia, the empire is kept intact. And so then there's going to be the Revenge War about a decade later, and that's the 7 Years' War, where the Austrians formed an alliance with the goal of dismembering Prussia. And so the Prussians are able to survive this, but we can see in these conflicts then a rivalry between Austria and Prussia over the domination of Germany. And we can see at this point that Prussia has emerged as a great power, a power that has to be taken seriously in any balance of power calculation. And so the two states have kind of a love-hate relationship. Sometimes they're going to be on the same side. That was the case in the War of the Spanish Succession and the Napoleonic Wars. And then sometimes they're going to be at each other's throats trying to enhance their own standing in Germany. All right, so I'll stop there for today. And so the next one, we'll pick up with the Enlightenment in Germany, run through the unification of Germany, and pick up with Russia.